Story 1. The Forgotten Patient. Dr. Emily Carter had always considered herself a rational person. After years of working late shifts at the county hospital, she thought she'd seen it all. That belief shattered one fateful night when, in the oppressive silence of the hospital's basement, she stumbled upon an old, dusty file labeled Patient 24601. Emily's curiosity piqued immediately. She had never heard of this patient, and the file seemed out of place in the otherwise orderly archives. Pulling the file closer, she brushed off a thick layer of dust, sneezing as particles filled the stale air. The file was brittle, its papers yellowed with age. The first few pages were standard: a name, Charlotte Mason, a date of birth, and a list of symptoms. The details were unnerving. Charlotte had been admitted in 1976, suffering from extreme paranoia and hallucinations. She claimed to see shadowy figures that whispered her name at night, their voices growing louder whenever she tried to sleep. The doctor's notes were clinical at first, suggesting treatment plans and medication adjustments. But as Emily read further, the notes became increasingly erratic. The attending physician had scribbled frantic observations. Patient insists shadow figures are not hallucinations. Refuses to sleep. Claims they touch her. The next entry was more disturbing. Staff reports strange noises from her room at night. Scratching sounds. Patient found under bed, screaming, "They're coming!" Emily's hands began to shake as she turned to the final pages. One was smeared with what appeared to be dried blood. Across it were hastily scrawled words, "She never left." The air around her grew icy. Emily glanced at the window behind her, where her reflection should have been. Instead, she saw the outline of another figure, a woman with hollow dark eyes. Emily spun around, but the room was empty. After that night, the hospital seemed different. Lights flickered in the hallways, even after the maintenance crew swore everything was fine. Patients began reporting a shadowy woman lingering in their rooms. Emily tried to convince herself it was all a coincidence, but deep down, she knew the truth. Charlotte Mason, patient 24601, had never truly left the hospital. One night, as Emily reviewed patient records in her office, the lights flickered once more. A cold hand brushed against her shoulder, and a whisper filled her ears. "Why did you open my file?" Story 2. The Midnight Train. The midnight train was nearly empty when Jack boarded it. Exhausted from his long business trip, he dropped into a seat near the middle of the carriage. Across the aisle sat an old man in a tattered coat, staring vacantly out the window. The train lurched forward, its wheels clattering rhythmically against the tracks. Jack settled in, gazing out the window at the moonlit countryside. At first, he didn't notice anything unusual, but as the train sped onward, he realized the view outside never changed. The same grove of trees, the same abandoned barn over and over again, as though the train were trapped in a loop. Jack's unease grew. He turned to the old man who was now staring directly at him. The man's eyes were hollow, his expression blank. "You shouldn't have boarded this train," the man muttered. "What do you mean?" Jack asked, but the old man said nothing more. Jack decided to find the conductor. He moved to the next carriage, but it was empty. So was the next. The train seemed endless, each carriage identical to the last, with rows of empty seats stretching into darkness. When Jack returned to his seat, the old man was gone. In his place sat a pale woman clutching a worn suitcase. Jack tried to speak to her, but she ignored him, staring blankly ahead. The train began to fill with more passengers. They appeared out of nowhere, materializing in the seats around Jack. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes glassy and unfocused. Jack glanced out the window again. but his reflection wasn't there. Instead, he saw a shadowy figure staring back at him. Its face was twisted, almost animalistic, and its eyes glowed red. The train continued its endless journey through the night, and Jack realized he might never leave. Story 3: The Whispering Woods. Lila had always been drawn to the Whispering Woods. The forest was infamous in her hometown, surrounded by chilling legends and whispered warnings. Locals claimed that anyone who ventured too deep into the woods at night would disappear, never to be seen again. Determined to prove the stories wrong, Lila decided to enter the woods herself. Armed with a flashlight and her phone, she set off at midnight, following a narrow trail into the darkness. At first, the woods were silent except for the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. But as she ventured deeper, she began to hear whispers. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, then louder, forming words. "Turn back." Lila paused, her heart pounding. She scanned the forest with her flashlight but saw nothing unusual. Gathering her courage, she continued forward. The whispers grew more insistent, pleading, "Leave while you can." The trail began to twist and turn in unnatural ways, leading Lila in circles. Trees loomed larger, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. Shadows flickered in her peripheral vision, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, and the air felt heavy. A low growl shattered the stillness. Lila spun around, and her flashlight beam landed on a figure standing in the shadows. The figure was tall and skeletal, its eyes glowing like embers. It took a step toward her, and Lila screamed, turning to run. The trail was gone, swallowed by the forest. She stumbled blindly, the creature's footsteps echoing behind her. When she finally burst out of the woods at dawn, she was scratched and bruised. Her friends didn't believe her story, but the claw marks on her arms and the strange symbols carved into the trees told a different tale. Story 4: The Phantom Tenant. Sarah had been looking forward to moving into her new apartment. It was a charming old building with high ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and large windows that let in streams of sunlight. The landlord had mentioned its history, noting that it was one of the oldest structures in the city. That detail made Sarah like it even more. She loved places with character. But there was one thing she couldn't shake: the locked door in the hallway closet. It was old and rusted, its handle slightly tarnished, as if it hadn't been used in years. When Sarah asked the landlord about it, his expression changed slightly. "That's just an old utility room," he said quickly. "Nothing important in there. It's been sealed for decades." At first, Sarah didn't think much of it. The apartment was cozy, and she quickly settled into her new routine. But strange things began to happen. One night, Sarah was awoken by a faint tapping sound. It seemed to be coming from the closet. She approached the door cautiously, and the tapping stopped. "Is someone there?" she whispered. The silence stretched, but just as she was about to walk away, a low, muffled voice replied, "Let me out." Sarah froze in terror and backed away from the closet. The next morning, she called the landlord, but when he arrived, the door was gone. Instead, the back wall of the closet was smooth and unbroken. "I told you," he said nervously. "There's no door here." But Sarah knew what she had heard. The tapping and whispers continued every night, growing louder and more desperate. One night, she woke to find the figure of a man standing at the foot of her bed. His face was pale and featureless, and his presence radiated a suffocating dread. He raised a hand and pointed toward the closet. The next day, Sarah packed her belongings and fled the apartment, leaving behind whatever was locked inside. Story 5: The Cursed Mirror. Emma loved collecting antiques. Her home was filled with old clocks, books, and trinkets she had picked up over the years. So when she stumbled upon an ornate mirror at a flea market, she didn't hesitate to buy it. Its frame was beautiful, carved with intricate floral patterns and strange symbols she couldn't quite decipher. The seller hesitated as she handed over the money. "Are you sure you want this?" he asked, his voice low. "It's been troublesome." Emma shrugged off his warning, thinking it was just a way to spook her into paying more. She hung the mirror in her bedroom, admiring how it reflected the light. But soon, Emma noticed strange things. Her reflection lingered in the mirror even after she turned away. It started to smile when she wasn't. One night, her reflection moved independently, waving at her mockingly. Emma panicked, covering the mirror with a sheet, but the next morning the sheet was gone, and the mirror was back in its place. Terrified, Emma tried to smash the mirror with a hammer, but when she returned to the room, it was whole again. One night, her reflection stepped out of the mirror. Grinning men